Go home. The SG-1000 is done. It's Segaiden episode 28. What a long, strange, or at least eye-straining trip it's been. Actually, it hasn't been that long since I began the journey through the SG-1000 library, but the many, "why aren't you talking about NES games?" questions I've received over the past year have aged me by about a decade. But this episode wraps a second console on VideoWorks, and while Sega's first home system doesn't have the same Nintendo fan appeal as Virtual Boy, it's a vastly more important platform from a historic perspective. I'll be covering all of that next week in the SG-1000 wrap-up, but first, there are still 2 more games to go. Actually, depending on who you ask, there may be just 1 more SG-1000 game to go. Sega's first of 2 SG-1000 releases for 1987, Loretta No Shouzou, Sherlock Holmes, has a tendency to be grouped as a Mark III or Master System game by many people, and for pretty good reason. As with the Castle, Sega shipped this one in gold cartridge packaging, identical to the ones Mark III cartridges came in. For all intents and purposes, this may as well be a Mark III game, aside from the fact that it runs on an SG-1000, and it looks a lot uglier than anything designed specifically for the Mark III. In terms of content and scope though, Loretta No Shouzou, Sherlock Holmes, outshines anything else on the console. Even the Castle and Wonder Boy were far simpler and more basic than this graphical adventure, which brings a full-on detective mystery to a console that predates Japan's love for the genre. Yes, as anyone with a passing familiarity with the whims of the Japanese market in the mid-80s will immediately intuit it, Loretta No Shouzou absolutely sees Sega making their own attempt at jumping on the detective adventure bandwagon kicked off a few years earlier by Enix's Portopia Renzoku Satsugen Jiken, the PC murder mystery that launched Yuji Horii into superstardom and paved the way for Dragon Quest. Every Japanese publisher worth its salt cranked out 1 or 2 of these in the mid to late 80s, including Nintendo, whose own take on the format, Famicom Tante Club, recently received a remake and official international localization for Switch. You won't find Loretta No Shouzou in any Sega retro compilations or remake packages, because it's been largely forgotten by the gaming public. It does have the honor, if you want to call it that, of jockeying for a place in the SG-1000's Shitano. Complete copies often sell for a couple $100 at this point. But I'd be hard-pressed to call this a lost classic. It's about what you'd expect from a detective mystery graphical adventure from this era on such badly dated hardware. Now bear in mind, Loretta No Shouzou is one of the few SG-1000 games for which Sega has provided a firm, documented release date, February of 1987. For reference, other big releases of the same fiscal quarter include the Famicom versions of Zelda 2, Dragon Quest 2, The Goonies 2, 3D World Runner, and Otoki, as well as notable Mark III releases like Alex Kidd in Miracle World, Space Harrier, and Wonder Boy. By comparison to those works, Loretta No Shouzou looks and feels hopelessly primitive. I will say that the game reads a lot better on a CRT screen than it comes across here with the clean RGB capture. The natural softness and scan lines or shadow masks of a CRT go a long way toward muting these vivid slabs of solid color and creating the impression of shading and natural blending. But even so, this game really pushes the SG-1000 beyond its intended parameters, with full-screen visuals depicting dozens of locations, a considerable amount of dialogue, an inventory system, and a password mechanic. You can see the console racing to redraw its picture when the dialogue or menu boxes appear on screen. While it may not be quite as clunky in that regard as an early home computer like a VIC-20 or something, you can practically hear the hardware groaning in distress at times. Admittedly, it could be tough to hear the hardware's plaintive cries over your own. Loretta No Shouzou falls afoul of many of the frustrations that usually go hand in hand with games of this style and this vintage. There's a lot of guesswork and unintuitive choices involved. Thankfully, I was able to poke around at the game with the help of both a no-nonsense guide at GameFAQs and live translation help courtesy of Brian Clark of 1millionpower.com. But I can't imagine playing this game blind, even in your own native language. It involves a lot of travel to locations where you need to perform specific tasks in order to progress. Our hero, a fellow by the name of Sherlock Holmes, who is presumably the public domain version since he doesn't fall in love in this story, travels throughout London and beyond, And this London is a pretty big place. The city consists of a 7x5 grid, each square of which represents an interactive location where you may need to talk to a person, enter a house, or even use it as a gateway to a subsequent location. The in-game dialogue gives you clues and directions when you talk to the correct people, but in order to extract those clues, you need to figure out which part of town those people live in and how you should approach them. For example, Holmes can bribe certain people, but within the first in-game day of the story, you need to use the bribe ability twice, but you only have enough cash for a single bribe. To perform the second bribe, you somehow need to figure out that you can find more money hidden in a bookcase in Holmes's study. And even if you know that, you need to click on it just so with the search cursor in order to actually be able to trigger it. It also doesn't help that many of the in-game locations look more or less identical to one another. Many homes and street scenes use the exact same visuals, which can be disorienting. It also means you'll use the cursor to click on seemingly identical items over and over again, hoping you'll trigger a response from one of them this time around. On the other hand, there is something to be said for an SG-1000 game that features extensive text menus and a free-moving on-screen cursor. On yet another hand, the whole affair sure can be sluggish to play as you wade through all those text options. The main action menu has 2 separate pages, each with 6 options apiece. These range from obvious commands like ask, take, use, and hit to less common abilities like summon a person and travel. There's a lot of options to shuffle through on each screen, and even after you use process of elimination to, for example, determine that you don't need to punch or shoot a random passerby on the streets of London, each screen of the game still presents you with dozens of different command options to sort through, many of which require you to move your cursor around and interact with invisible hotspots just so. In other words, it's pretty typical adventure game design for the era. Although I didn't play this game through to the end, it doesn't seem like you can box yourself into an unwinnable situation by, say, failing to collect a critical item at the correct time. For example, at the end of the first day, you need to visit an artist's house and use Holmes's cane to tap on the ceiling to reveal a hidden package. The package in question is the eponymous Loretta No Shouzou, a painting of a girl wearing a red hat, which has gone missing from an art gallery whose owner has hired Holmes to track down said painting. So you manage to solve that portion of the case quite quickly, but that just opens up a bigger mystery that involves additional investigation, tramping through a maze with a magnifying glass, and ultimately shooting another man in self-defense. But let's look back to the moment you recover the painting. You need to use Holmes's cane in order to strike the ceiling, which is not an immediately intuitive task, nor one hinted at in the on-screen dialogue. It's entirely possible to have missed the fact that you could collect the cane in Holmes's study and fail to add it to your inventory before setting out to the village where the artist lives. Some adventure games would basically end there, locking you into an unwinnable state because you failed to bring along a critical item. But Loretta No Shouzou doesn't burden you like that. Holmes can simply hop back onto the train to London and collect the cane before returning to the quiet village where he can then assault the local masonry. The downside of this leniency, of course, is that if you fail to intuit your task at the artist's home, you could easily assume you needed to complete a different goal elsewhere in the game's dozens of locations first. It's game design that leads to lots of wandering, and dead ends, and blind guesswork, which is not exactly my cup of Darjeeling. Even if I'm not a huge fan of the style of game, I recognize that Loretta No Shouzou is a monumental feat for Sega's dev team. As the final original work for the console, this truly does feel like the SG-1000's swan song, a massive, relatively modern, fairly complex time sink of an adventure. Is it particularly attractive or entertaining 35 years later? No. But consider the humble place this console began, churning out sluggish or even outlandishly awful arcade conversions, and you can't help but be impressed by what Sega's internal team has accomplished here. A game that punches far above the console's weight class and without any compromises beyond those that were simply part and parcel of this particular genre. Does that make this a heck of a send-off? Well, yeah, no shit, Sherlock. And finally, the last of the official releases for SG-1000 is a game in its own way every bit as ambitious as Wonder Boy or Loretta No Shouzou, and it's something you're even less likely to want to play in the here and now. The year was 1987, and even Sega and the humble SG-1000 weren't immune from the glittering allure of Japan's obsession with the console role-playing game. Dragon Quest had blossomed into a sleeper hit thanks to a heavy marketing push in Shonen Jump magazine, and Enix and Chunsoft, etc., had already delivered the sequel that would cement the franchise as a permanent force in the medium. Everyone else sought to ride the same wave of enthusiasm that drove Dragon Quest to the top of the charts, folding role-playing elements into every game they could manage, regardless of how appropriate a fit those items may have been. The Black Onyx appears to have arrived on SG-1000 sometime around March of 1987. This is going by some in-depth publications research by viewer Zachary Harper. By March of 1987, this particular piece of hardware was beyond moribund. Certainly, it was far too late in the SG-1000's life for Sega to invest the time and energy into creating a new role-playing adventure for the console. Sega would release an all-new role-playing adventure later in the year, but that would be for Mark III with Phantasy Star. The Black Onyx is not Phantasy Star. It has no story to speak of, no individual characters, minimalist visuals, obtuse play mechanics, and a generally unfriendly nature. It also has no battery backup, being a MyCard game. To save your progress in the Black Onyx, you record and input passwords. In fairness, that is how the original Dragon Quest games worked before the saintly Satoru Iwata reworked them to incorporate battery backup for the US releases. But the Black Onyx reveals its trying too hard nature in the fact that you record not a single password in order to resume your adventure, but rather as many as 5. Each of your party members needs to record their progression individually for you to resume a game, or in fact, to retain your hard-fought character level and gear advancement if they die. There's no real way to resuscitate a fallen character that I'm aware of in the Black Onyx. Once a warrior eats turf, that's it. They're gone forever, unless you have a password to record their previous state of being, which allows you to load in that version of the fighter in a sense. This is sort of the Black Onyx in a nutshell. It's basically wizardry with the same general flow, structure, and massive inconveniences. When the Black Onyx debuted on Japanese home computers in 1984, it blew the doors off the sale charts. Multiple online resources give sales figures of more than 150,000 units, just on home computers in Japan, which is an absolutely unbelievable number, and puts this formative role player right up there with the likes of Falcom Xanadu and Bruderbund's Lode Runner. The game eventually made its way to a number of consoles, including the Famicom and Game Boy Color, as well as to computer platforms like the MSX. The SG-1000 conversion, surprisingly, is not a direct port of the MSX release. Sega's version looks a little bit nicer, with a bigger dungeon view window to enjoy, and that's despite this game running on a less powerful platform than even the base model MSX, and shipping on a MyCard, with none of the boosts to RAM or data capacity enjoyed by latter-day cartridge releases like the Castle and Loretta No Shouzou. I'm going to be honest though, the Black Onyx is even harder to return to today than Loretta No Shouzou. It's a slow, limited, unfriendly, and obtuse RPG. Of course, the same holds true for more or less any vintage dungeon crawler. Almost exactly 20 years after this release shipped, future Sega subsidiary Atlus published Etrian Odyssey, which dared to ask, what if we made a wizardry-style game, but included accessibility and quality of life features that would make it fun? But cast yourself back into the world of March 1987, when your only options for a pure role-playing adventure on a game console were essentially limited to this and the first 2 Dragon Quest titles. Developers were just beginning to integrate RPG mechanics into other genres. The Black Onyx hit SG-1000 around the same time the games like Wing of Medola, Zelda 2, and Rygar hit Famicom. But in terms of menu-driven games, where you build a party and take turn whacking monsters, this was it. Even Dragon Quest 1 and 2 felt diluted, in a sense, in that the first game didn't offer a party feature, and the second doled out 3 mandatory, predefined characters at fixed intervals in the story. The Black Onyx for SG-1000 predates basically every other turn-based RPG on consoles. It may not be friendly or even fun, but you have to imagine that for console fanatics hungry for another dopamine hit of watching numbers get bigger as you wade through endless text-based abstractions of battle encounters, this was your surest bet for a while. And to be fair, primitive as it looks now, the Black Onyx manages to pack quite a bit of content onto this MyCard. In keeping with the fashion of wizardry in the Bard's Tale, the Black Onyx begins in a town that, visually speaking, is indistinguishable from the dungeons. You even have random encounters in towns. The difference between a town and a dungeon is that the entities you randomly encounter in towns are friendly humans, who will parlay with you or even join your party if you need to bolster your ranks to a full set of 5. You can fight these humans, but even if you manage to win and swipe cash from their corpse, that just means you're likely to turn the entire city against you and die in a gutter somewhere due to constant random hostile encounters. Not that the Black Onyx has gutters. The game consists of barely better than wireframe 3D spaces rendered in the familiar tones of the SG-1000's palette. Shocking lime green walls, sherbet orange doors, cavernous blacks. Of course, most of your time is going to be spent in the much simpler looking combat screen, where your tiny character sprites face off against tiny enemy character sprites. Combat here more or less consists of sides taking turns hitting one another until everyone's dead, which is determined with simple health meters beside each combatant. You earn cash by surviving combat, and that cash can be exchanged for better equipment at a shop. Bolstering your gear is how you upgrade here, not by leveling up. The better your gear, the longer your health meter, and therefore the longer you can survive combat. The town contains a few locations of interest, including a cemetery and the shop, but more importantly, it contains entrances to 6 different dungeons. Once you enter a dungeon, it's all combat all the way, and progression is slow going as you grind for cash, then trudge back to exchange it for gear. In all honesty, the Black Onyx is much easier to appreciate for its place in history than for its modern day appeal, which is roughly nil. Historically though, yes, it's pretty interesting. Not only was this the final game Sega ever published for SG-1000, and yes, its relative rarity and prominence means its aftermarket pricing puts it in contention for the pantheon of the system's Shitano, along with Golkov and Loretta No Shouzou. It was also, by all accounts, the first ever RPG designed specifically for the Japanese market, complete with Japanese text. Its success made developer Bulletproof Software something of a minor powerhouse, and gave the game's designer and programmer, a Dutch immigrant named Henk Rogers, considerable clout and connections within the industry. Rogers, of course, would later parlay that clout into an opportunity to make gaming history a second time by taking an active role in the localization of Tetris. But that's an entirely different story. For now, the Black Onyx brings the SG-1000 to its epic, daunting conclusion. But rather than look at this as the end of a story, why not see it as the gateway to another, more successful tale? The Black Onyx and its first-person dungeon crawler would enjoy a proper spiritual successor at the end of the year on the SG-1000's successor. In December, Sega would publish Phantasy Star for Mark III, a game built in the shape of the Black Onyx, but a generational leap or two ahead in terms of tech, design, and accessibility. Would Phantasy Star have existed without the Black Onyx? It's impossible to speculate, but at the very least, it makes for a heck of a segue. Before we move on to the Mark III and Master System though, Segaiden is going to take one more episode to look at the legacy of the SG-1000, to talk about its history, and correct the many goofs and gaffes I've made during this year-long journey of discovery and exploration.